This is the story of an expedition I undertook after I'd qualified in the UK and was itching to see the world. I made up my mind that I was going to drive to India. It didn't work out that way. I'd bought a Land Rover, I'd bought a caravan, and I was looking for somebody to travel with, advertised in the Times and the Telegraph, but nobody responded except one person who obviously looked completely daft, and I thought, this isn't going to work. At that time, I happened to see an advert for a company called Encounter Overland to do a trip down the length of Africa. It was going to cost £300, and all food and gear and vehicle was provided by them. And I thought, okay, that'll do. So on the 21st of November 1970, I was dropped at Victoria Station in London by my good friend Nigel Brown, and there were 3 ex-army trucks lined up, all with a new coat of blue paint, and each carrying 16 passengers and 2 drivers. We set off for Dover. We had only got about 20 minutes into the trip when the first breakdown occurred, and we pulled off at the edge of the motorway, and fortunately one of the drivers was a bit of a mechanic, and we were fixed up and on our way again. But by this time we had really missed our ferry out of Dover. It was interesting how there was complete silence in the back of the truck, as nobody knew each other. But the moment we had broken down, everybody spoke, and we soon got to know where we should be applying our blame and where we should be criticizing the organization who were running this show. We got to Dover and we were able to rebook on another form of transport, and so I'll let you enjoy the story from here. So here we are. We eventually got to Dover after being arrested just down the road for having no license or lights that dipped the wrong way. And we were ready to board our Convercraft. Unfortunately, we missed the one we were meant to be on, but we climbed aboard this one, and so started our journey. And here are the trucks loading in. The 3 trucks in all. So here we are in northern France. 3 trucks, as I said, each developed a name. The youngies, the oldies, and us in the middle, who were all in their 20s, I guess. Each truck had 2 drivers and 16 passengers. The weather quickly deteriorated, and cold rain swept in over northern France. And that night, we booked into a youth hostel because nobody fancied putting tents up. Here we are at the bottom of Spain, having been through Madrid, and we're at the Alhambra, a Moorish mosque built before the Europeans drove the moors back into North Africa. Beautiful building. And here we are now getting on the ferry to go across into North Africa from Algeciras. The trucks look very smart at this stage, all ex-army, and with one coat of blue paint over them, which was soon to wear off. Here we are in Morocco, and driving now up into the Atlas Mountains, the Rif Mountains in particular. And we're getting used to living in a truck. We'd stop for coffee, it would take time to brew it up, and we were approached here to buy some hashish from the locals. I don't think we took them up, but this was the bartering session that went on. Now we came towards Algiers, and Algiers is a very, very old port. Beautiful old city. And we spent time gathering supplies, viz. Beer and more beer, into the truck. We had time to wait there as we were awaiting Nigerian visas. So explored the old town and the harbour. And here's the beer being loaded onto the trucks. We were in a campsite just outside Algiers, and I remember the howling of the dogs. And here we are on a road heading into the Sahara. You can see it's still tarmacked, but it wasn't going to be for long. Quite dramatic countryside. Here's the sign that tells us that Cape Town was 13,000 kilometers away, and warning us that there were no petrol stops for 500 miles or something. It was the first camel train we'd seen, wandering slowly, no particular direction, no particular road they were following. And we got to a town called Gardia, where there was a camel market. So if you want to buy a camel, this is where you come. We stocked up with various supplies and had a wonderful dinner of soup, curry, and an orange. The scenes looked more biblical than anything. Water was our biggest question because water was not on tap. And here we are in a little oasis outside where we stopped for the night. There were plenty of figs and quite a few oranges, and we enjoyed them. Next day, on with the driving across the Tadamit Plateau. The land was getting barer and barer and hotter, although at night it was quite cool. Here's one of the old French forts in North Africa, Fort Mirabel, now abandoned, and we slept under these arches. We found a well, which we needed because we had to draw water from it. And onwards. You can see the tarmac's run out. It's all dirt from here on, and the main feature for the passengers was that everything got dusty. And here's brave me going across this desert. Not sand at this stage, just rocks and stone. A couple of days out of Tamanrasset, where we had been detained for a couple of days waiting for fuel to arrive, we were heading out and suddenly suffered our first major mechanical breakdown. Turned out that we'd blown a cylinder head gasket, and the only spare that the truck carried happened to be a cylinder head gasket. And fortunately we had a guy driving who was a capable mechanic, and so began a repair process which probably took 3 or 4 hours. In the meantime, all the passengers just had to fill in themselves with whatever they wanted to do. And one girl happened to walk to get some view of the truck from a distance. In the desert, it's amazing how images can mask what is really there. And instead of turning round and coming back to the truck, she had wandered on. When the repair was complete, everybody asked, "And what's happened to this girl?" Nobody knew. We stood on the roof, couldn't see anything moving, nothing alive. And it was suddenly that a little glint of light was seen at a huge distance. So we drove over towards where it was, and slowly emerged this tiny dot, which turned out to be this girl walking completely the wrong way. And I think she was very lucky that we found her. The cabs on these ex-army trucks had a place where you could stand above the cab and admire the view, and we used to sit on the roof or stand in the hole. We soon learned that the roads were quite rough and several major punctures, and I was glad that I didn't have to climb around underneath the truck to change the wheels. Quite dramatic countryside. And here we are in the main town of Tamanrasset in the middle of the Sahara. These beautiful blue gowns that were worn were a fabulous colour. There's some of our troop taking a camel ride. And here there was a wedding going on, we discovered. And everybody had large rifles which were fired into the ground or into the air by the men folk who danced around. You'd have to mind your toes, I think. You can see the dust that they fire into the ground. Remarkable old ex-volcanic mounds in the middle of nowhere. And we still had a road at this stage, which we should have been thankful for. And very strangely, here in the middle of this totally dry area, there was a river. Started, ran down a hill, and disappeared again. Fresh water for the taking. The locals came over to see us. You can see how weather-worn all these ex-volcanoes are. Walking up to a little place where a hermit priest lived in the late 1800s to early 1900s. And he lived on fish caught in the waters below. This was his house, which he must have built himself. What an astounding life he must have had. Unfortunately, he was eventually murdered, which wasn't a very happy end. Onwards into the southern Sahara, we entered civilization again with these wonderful reed huts and people who didn't like their photographs being taken. Quite naturally, of course. Sunsets were terrific, but boy was it cold at night, and the water would freeze in the containers overnight. Camel trains generally carried salt northwards. And here we are, the road getting rougher and rougher. And we're on the border to cross into Niger. we came across some German tourists in a VW, which just didn't have the depth or the tyres, also a motorbike, and we pulled them out of the sandy bits for quite a while. We had them being towed for miles and miles. Another market if you want to buy goats. And real cattle with real horns, pulling up water from a deep well. You wouldn't want to get cross with those horns. Eventually we crossed into Nigeria, and this is Kano, a major city in the north of Nigeria, where we happened to stop on Christmas Day. Christmas Day 1970. We found a service club who invited us in, and we could stay there right through the Christmas period. They had a beautiful pool, some more than adequate food, and we all cleaned up and laid down enjoying breakfast and real yogurt. Look at it. This was a big treat because we'd been on dry rations and wheat bix for a long time. So here's the group. A memorable Christmas. It was strange to come across this civilization in the middle of such a deserted area. Onwards, next day, Boxing Day, we were off again and heading towards the Chad border. The Central African Republic was really quite beautiful to drive through. Here's a baobab tree, an upside down tree, as they're called. That night there was a huge thunderstorm, and the next day the river had flooded and the road had been washed away. So we had to wait while they did quite a lot of repair work to provide us with a path to get across. The Africans are very clever though. They build roadways like this, no trouble at all. Trucks tipping dirt into the water until they've actually restored a road. So we weren't delayed long, and we got across to the other side and onwards towards the Congo. Some of the ferries were a little dodgy, to say the least. And one wondered how they survived carrying the weight of of a truck and trailer, together with 18 people. But we got across, and this is in Chad, I think. Very different countryside now. And there's Lake Chad. And families who didn't want to be photographed. Plenty of bananas and pawpaws. Stored in these domed structures. Here's the truck looking a bit more worn as we stopped to take photographs. These are made out of clay, hand dried under the sun. Wherever we stopped, we were completely surrounded by people interested to see who we were and what we were doing. We're now into river country as we approach the Congo, and there's some fantastic waterfalls. Slept outside under the stars and saw lots of stars. I lost my words.
Shooting stars?
Shooting stars, yeah. Lots of shooting stars. From now on, however, mozzies and big ants would not encourage you to sleep out without a big mozzie net over your little camping bed. Some fine pawpaws. And here we are now by the Congo River. Huge, very fast flowing, massive river, driving off one of the ferries that carries you across it. We'd go to bed at night and threaten to be up really early the next morning before the crowd arrived. But the crowds would be there to watch us come out of our sleeping bags and get dressed and have breakfast and so on. This is the Ubongi River. and they were borrowing some of our petrol in order to drive the ferry across. I don't think these boats were really designed for that many heavy trucks. It was difficult to find anywhere private, that's for sure. There's my friend Colin doing the washing up. And here we are in a village with real quality housing and wonderful sleeping beds. And the people were fun. They always wanted to see what we were doing, and we wanted to see what they were doing. That's an anthill in there. And if anybody wants a banana, there are some for sale here. This is a rubber plantation left over from the Belgians, who would have planted and grown this as an enterprise through the early 1900s. And here's another place up the main Congo River, which is navigable from the sea all the way up to the Stanley Falls. The odd snake. You had to be a bit careful at night where you put your camp bed down. And these are the deserted ruins left by the Belgians after the fighting in 1962. And the shell garage, which looks as though it hasn't seen action for 20 years. In the next few shots, you will see all sorts of trucks peeling off the road. You might think this is just bad driving. The roads in the Congo were just so bad that it was really hard to stay on the road. First we went through the Central African Republic, and that was a most beautiful area. Dozens, not millions, of butterflies. All sorts of butterflies, and you could buy them in a box with probably 500 in if you wanted, for $5 off the locals. Once we got into the Congo, there were lots of ghost towns which had been inhabited by the Belgians and were knocked out in the war of the 1960s. In one town we found 2 shops, one absolutely full of kerosene lamps, brand new, no kerosene. The other full of the world's best hi-fi equipment, no electricity. In 1966, the Congolese were said to have killed 60,000 educated Congolese, put them in sacks and thrown them into the river. It was a torrid time. So in fact the Congo is probably the most dramatic part of this trip. The trucks were falling to bits at a rate of knots. We lost 2 engine mounts on the one I was on. The trailer springs had given up, and we had blocks of wood underneath the springs in order to stop the thing lapsing onto the ground. We had no exhaust system at all, and at one stage we abandoned the truck at the bottom of a gully where we had driven down to try and pick up water because it had just got stuck in mud far too deep. We were actually pulled out. An English woman whom we met, her husband ran a local hotel, which was fine because he escaped, because the Congolese military wanted the pub open. His brother-in-law was not so lucky, was killed, thrown into a bag, and again thrown down the river. For at least a couple of nights we had to camp in the garage on a lift, which was the only place that we could find that was flat and level to put a couple of camp beds down on. That night I cooked for 36 because we had 2 trucks worth of people, and I made a note in my diary of the excellent meal. It was soup followed by curry with leeks and instant whip for pudding. We couldn't have done better. So now I'll return to the pictures and you can see where this takes us as we motor through the Congo. Now heading towards a town called Buta, but we misjudged the edge of the road and tipped off, and it required another truck to come and tow us out. All part of a daily drama. I think the message is never travel on your own, always have another vehicle there ready to tow you out, because there's plenty of places where you need that. Rivers predominate this country and are really the main form of transport. Their roads are terrible. We've lost the front off our radiator and the truck's well bogged down, as you can see. So an enormous amount of digging and pulling and shoving. But eventually there is rescue. And here's an example of winnowing the old-fashioned way, where they sort the wheat from the chaff. Oops, another off-road relay. Very greasy, wet clay everywhere, which made it very difficult to stay in a straight line. And the witch doctor would help if he could. And here are the falls at Stanley Falls. Again, the relics of old Belgian Congo habitation. We took a dugout one day to explore the river, which was quite rough. That's me on the right, getting thinner and thinner.
Braving the camera on a overloaded, easy to tip over boat.
Correct. It was the volume and speed of the water which was really amazing. Huge amounts of water pouring down this river. And we're into pygmy country. These pygmies have been banana hunting. The pygmies gladly bought my shirt in exchange for a bow and arrow, which I've still got today. Their houses look not entirely watertight. Roads in the Congo get worse and worse. You wouldn't call this a motorway by any standards. But the people are always pleased to see you. Always dancing. Always something going on. In this case, it was another wedding. We're into the very hilly country approaching East Africa here. We're sort of right alongside Rwanda and other countries like that. But having come down a major mountain road one morning, we completely lost the suspension on one side of the vehicle and it tipped over. Causing permanent damage ripped all the wheels off. I was fortunate. I landed in the middle of a rather large Welshman, and his belly saved me from damage, but the vehicle was a complete write-off. As you can see, there's not one bit of it's underneath which is attached to the right place. So we bailed everything out into the trailer which had survived. And amazingly, nobody was really hurt. The people sitting on the roof were thrown about 40 feet out ahead of the vehicle and bounced along the ground. None of them had broken bones. It was very fortunate, actually. And we finished up at a mission house in the middle here, where they produced bowls of fruit and strawberries the size of, you've never seen anything like it. And for not having fresh fruit or fresh food for a long while, it was quite exciting. This rescue truck took us from the mission station where we'd been rescued to into East Africa. We were longing to get to East Africa because we imagined that that's where the tarmac restarted after months of wading through very, very clayey grounds and roads. However, when we got to the border, we were stopped by border police and the army, and they did a thorough inspection of the whole vehicle. They wanted to know whether we had smoke bombs on board, and we pleaded that no, we didn't have smoke bombs. They eventually lined some of us up on a roundabout with guns to our heads, saying, what do we do with these people? They thought we were mercenaries from Tanzania, and it turned out that there had been a coup overnight in Uganda, and General Amen had taken over. Everybody was therefore on strict alert for any problems coming in from other countries surrounding Uganda. Eventually, we persuaded them that we were just mere English tourists, and they let us through. So here's the other truck towing our trailer as well as its own trailer, heading for the border to East Africa, to Uganda. We, of course, didn't have a truck because we had sold it to the local policeman for 500 kwachas, and so we managed to catch a plane into Entebbe. It was a 70-minute flight in a DC-3, and we got into the capital, Kampala, where we shared a room with a lot of ants. And that's Lake Victoria we've just flown over. Once established in the oldies truck, we started to head south, meeting some of the best game parks in the world, the Nairobi Park and then the Serengeti. These were truly marvellous in terms of seeing a whole range of beasts. Thompson's gazelles were particularly beautiful. They're fine animals. Unfortunately, eaten by lions fairly regularly. And a load of silly zebras that, when they get together, seem to have a lot of fun. Here are some taller people, reaching 20 or 30 feet high. They're most ungainly animals, but they're absolutely fantastic. And quite a variety of things living, including tortoises. And these fellows who had come up looking for food, they had obviously seen some tourist drive pasts previously. So we could sit on the roof of the truck and feel quite safe. And we did all sorts of bad things by throwing them bits of food. Here are the zebras going mad. Oh, and the odd ostrich. You don't want to get in his way. Lake Nakuru is famed for its flamingos. The whole edge of the lake is completely full of them, thousands of them. The only thing lacking here is the real depth of colour. My camera obviously wasn't good enough. And if you look here, you can see there's a whole armada of flamingos in the water. But they appear white. In fact, they were bright orange, bright red. I'd hired a car with these two who were truck members, and we'd driven up to this lake. There were a few pelicans in there as well. And this is the car we'd hired, a good old VW. And you can see the salt on the edge of the lake, completely white. From there we were back on the truck and driving along the edge of the Rift Valley. You can see the rift, sudden drop in height. And all we did, this was between some time we had, and then we returned to Nairobi. This is the city of Nairobi. Lovely city, very conventional English city. And we'd camped in a formal campsite. Very rare, but this is us. Magnificent colours of the trees and stuff. These are baobab trees in the middle of a nearby park. Animals all around us. Some elephants. Sitting on top of the van and watching these things approach us from a distance of about 20 meters can be a little concerning. And when they wag their ears at you, you know you're in trouble. Time to move on. And there's a train in the distance crossing the grassland plains. Uh-oh. It's time to think about moving along. He's looking as though he's getting a bit distressed. It wouldn't take him long to cover the distance between where he is and our truck. Down on the coast to Mombasa, we drove up the coastline about 50 kilometers, I think, and it was an interesting trip. These are Arab ruins from the 13th or 14th century, when the Arabs came down and built considerable estates for themselves. They've since, of course, been driven out. We were aiming for a beautiful resort called Malindi, which had the most magnificent looking beach and water. And we spent a couple of days here enjoying a relaxation, actually, from the rigours of driving every day. Water was warm. And this is the Turtle Bay Underwater National Park, which we saw in glass-bottomed boats, and we went snorkeling. This picture is taken through the boat, through the bottom of the boat. The colours of the fish don't really come through on film. Onwards to Kilimanjaro, the highest mountain in Africa. And we crossed the Tanzanian border at 4 p.m. on February the 6th, 1971. Unfortunately, the box underneath the truck that drives four-wheel drive rather than just two-wheel drive sheared its bolts and fell off, and we had to rope it on until we could get to a garage who could weld it back into place. There's the top of Kilimanjaro with snow on it, because it's quite high. It's funny to see snow in the middle of a hot African plain. Some fantastic sunsets in this part of Africa. We were up early next morning to visit the Ngorongoro crater, a most amazing sight I think we'd ever seen in Africa. Deep crater walls. The crater's probably 20 miles across, and you descend down a very steep track for several hundred meters, and the little black dots that appear as you start to go down turn into individual flocks of animals, and the whole place is absolutely jam-packed with animals of every sort. Wildebeest, Thompson's gazelles, baboons, hyenas, zebras, vultures, waterbuck, lions, elephants, flamingos, the story goes on, ostriches, monkeys, and the bat-eared fox. The weather was absolutely perfect, and we had a whole day entranced by all these animals. You could get quite near lion. They didn't seem frightened of us. I think they'd just been fed, so we weren't in any great danger. You can see why lions are called the king of beasts. They really are huge and magnificent. There's Mr. and Mrs. Lion walking off. We met up with the other truck down at the bottom of the Ngorongoro crater. Ah, here's a newcomer. A leopard. He's just about to climb this tree. Leopards are very happy sleeping right up trees. But when we drove over to see him, I, for one, who was sitting on the roof, was getting a bit twitchy. Once he started to move, it wouldn't take him much to jump from there straight onto the truck roof. Here he goes. Whoa. Beautiful animals, but highly unpredictable. It was late by the time we started climbing out, and we camped at the exit, which had officially closed at 6. So the game parks of East Africa having been completed, it was more or less a straight drive down to the south, through Tanzania and into Zimbabwe. We were on concrete roads, or proper roads, most of the way. The next big sightseeing opportunity was the Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, and here we are at the top of the falls watching the water approach this giant, amazing waterfall. We walked up to it through increasing drizzle to complete rainstorm created by the water in the air. Absolutely remarkable. The water pours off the width of this waterfall, probably a mile, down 300 or 400 feet into a chasm. It's the most dramatic waterfall in the world. And the rainbows and the colours that were set up by the rainbows were just astounding. We were totally drenched, but then we were really only wearing swimming gear. Sensibly, we'd left our dry gear back at the camp. His friend Linda stepping through from the edge of the grass. And there's the big bridge which links Zimbabwe and places south. You wouldn't want to go over these waterfalls in a barrel, as one man did, I think unsuccessfully. And here we are on the bridge with its remarkable view of these falls. And here's Mr. Livingstone, who discovered them. Well, I should say discovered them from the Western point of view, because they've been here for thousands and thousands of years. The clouds of water vapour could be seen for miles around, standing above the countryside. And so on towards South Africa. We crossed Beit Bridge, which is the entrance to South Africa, where we were checked in without a great deal of fuss. And this, I think, is our last breakfast on the road. After 97 days and 12,500 miles, we eventually reached Johannesburg. And we got there in a truck and a trailer that had been welded up about 100 times, but made it in the end. Colin and Linda are lifetime friends, with Bill, one of the drivers of the truck. And so we drove into Johannesburg. There we abandoned the truck, which was then driven into the neighbouring country, because due to their lax systems, one was able to drive out of South Africa and have one's carnet signed off, but they didn't require us to check into the next country. The vehicle was sold there later. And so we went down to Durban with Colin and Linda and the truck driver, and so started a new life in South Africa for a couple of years.